Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we are going to do a review of the OLED Steam Deck. Now I already did an impressions video about this a few days ago, and I talked about the screen and the controls mostly. In this video I want to focus on some of the other things, so for example the battery life and performance, and also I want to do a deep dive comparison between the old Steam Deck and the new one, and specifically what that's going to be like if you happen to have an old Steam Deck and you want to upgrade to the new one, and whether or not it's going to be worth it. So we're going to kind of go down a rabbit hole and answer that question by the end of this video. Either way, I think you're probably going to enjoy what we have to say here, and grab a snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Alright, I want to start here with a breakdown of all of the different options we have for the Steam Deck right now. Now the three main price points have remained the same. We have $400, $550, and $650. However, at each of those levels we now have an upgrade in what you'll actually get. For example, the cheapest option still has the same LCD model that we've had previously, but now instead of 64 gigabytes of internal storage, you're going to get 256. Meanwhile, the middle and high-end tiers both have that new OLED model we're reviewing here today. And the storage options have also doubled for each of these tiers. Now of note, the 1TB tier is the one that I'm reviewing today, and besides the storage space, the screen comes with an etched glass, which I talked about a lot in my impressions video. In addition, this tier of model comes with that special carrying case with a removable liner like I showed in that video as well. Now if you want to pay an additional $30 over the high-end tier, they are offering what they're calling the limited edition OLED model. And according to Valve, this one's going to have some limited stock, but there are a couple things that are pretty compelling about it. Number one, the case itself is transparent and looks really nice. And they've also added a bunch of orange accents to the model as well, and I think it does look very good. In addition, the liner within the carrying case also has a special design to it. And so those are the options you can expect when the pre-orders go live. Now on the Valve website, they spell out pretty clearly all the differences between the LCD and OLED models, but just for the sake of brevity, let's go over some of the major changes really quickly. Number one, there's been no changes when it comes to performance with the CPU. It's still the same Zen 2 4-core 8-thread APU. However, one big improvement is it now uses a 6nm process. And essentially what this means is the chip is going to run more efficiently, which is going to give you better battery life, and I've also found that you can hit the same performance metrics as the old Steam Deck, but with less power. In addition, the RAM has gotten a slight bump in specs. It's still 16GB in LPDDR5, but it runs at a faster bandwidth. It's now 6400 megatransfers per second compared to 5500. And because AMD APUs rely on memory bandwidth to increase performance, this will give us a little bit of a bump there as well. Now, of course, the biggest change here is going to be the display. It is now 7.4 inches because they've reduced the amount of bezels around the sides, which you can see right here in this footage with the Steam Deck OLED up top. In addition to being an OLED panel, it also supports HDR. This is the first handheld to actually do that. And another exciting factor about the screen is they've increased the refresh rate from 60Hz to 90. This means you'll be able to play many games at 90 frames per second. There's also been some improvements for other areas of the screen like color accuracy as well as overall brightness. Moving on, other improvements include the battery. It's now 25% larger at 50 watt-hours. In addition, they've also changed some of the battery chemistry to allow for faster charging. We've also seen improvements in connectivity, so now it runs at Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3. And this is significant because it now supports aptX HD as well as low latency. Now personally, I didn't get a chance to test the Bluetooth audio latency, but my buddy Rich over at Fan the Deck did, and he said that it improved it greatly, not quite perfect, but pretty close. Now one of the other benefits of switching over to an OLED panel is that it's thinner, and as a result, the device itself is actually lighter. So the OLED Steam Deck is now 30 grams lighter than the previous model. Now the list of other smaller improvements just goes on and on, so if you want to read more, I would recommend checking out their website. But a couple other worth noting is that they've improved the internals across the board. For example, because they have more room within the case, they've improved the fan and made it larger and also quieter. And they've also made the teardown and repair process a lot more efficient. And something I showed off in my impressions video is they've updated the top of the analog sticks to make it more grippy, and they've also slightly improved the diagonals on the D-pad. Additionally, they've increased the polling rate on the touchscreen, which should make it a lot more responsive when you're tapping it. And according to their documentation, they've improved the resume time by 30%. I'm not 100% sure what this is supposed to mean, but I think it means that when you wake up from sleep, it's supposed to be faster. And then finally, they've added a new feature that'll allow you to wake the device up from sleep with a Bluetooth controller. Now for these last 3 points, let's go ahead and actually test them right now just to give you a feel of how they're working. Number one, we'll start with the touchscreen. Like I mentioned, they have improved the pulling rate. And I'll say, just from my own personal experience testing out touchscreen games like Nintendo DS, that yes, I can definitely feel the difference here between the responsiveness and the accuracy of using the touchscreen. So if previously you didn't like using the touchpad, for example, to play Nintendo DS or 3DS games, I think you'll find this much improved. In addition, I did find that touch typing is a lot easier to do now as well. On the previous Steam Deck model, when I used my fingers to type like this, it was something that I kind of dreaded, and so I would always actively avoid it. However, this is so responsive now that I really don't mind it, so that's a big improvement for me. Now, when it comes to the improved resume time, if they are talking about waking from sleep, personally, I'm not really seeing it right now. But again, I'm not 100% sure that this is exactly what they were meaning. Perhaps they were talking about a deeper sleep, like for example, if you put it to sleep for a longer time. Either way, at least at first glance, I'm not seeing an improvement right here. Another thing to note is that I'm using a pre-release version of their firmware, and so some of these features might not be enabled just yet. For example, I did pair up a Bluetooth controller and then put the device to sleep, but I was not able to wake it back up from sleep using that controller. And I tried a bunch of different options, including docking it and using a 2.4 GHz dongle, but none of those would wake it from sleep. And this is something I'm definitely not alarmed about. I think it's just a result of the fact that I am using pre-release firmware. So I think by the time that retail units get into everyone else's hands, this is going to be a non-issue. Next, I want to talk a little bit more about the screen. Now, like I mentioned, I talked a lot about it in my impressions video, but as a quick recap, when it comes to a side-by-side comparison, I found that the Nintendo Switch OLED was probably your best one-to-one comparison. And so if you've ever tried a Nintendo Switch OLED and you were impressed by that screen, you're going to be equally impressed by the one on the Steam Deck. But I think the most stark contrast will come when you compare the old LCD panel on the original Steam Deck to the new one here. And honestly, it's really hard to show the difference between these two panels in a YouTube video. But yes, long story short, the colors are going to look a lot more rich and vibrant, and the contrast ratio between the dark and the bright colors is really impressive as well. And like I mentioned previously, this now supports HDR, and there are a lot of more modern PC games that support it as well. And one thing I didn't mention in my impressions video is that most of these games will have HDR calibration settings. And over the past few days, I've really enjoyed dialing in these settings for each specific game, because once you get it really locked in, it does look wonderful. So if you want to learn more about the screen and you haven't seen my impressions video yet, then I would recommend checking that out. But there are a couple other features I want to elaborate on in this video as well. To start, I want to talk about playing in a brightly lit room. And so here I'm playing in the middle of the day right next to a very large window. And even then, at max brightness, you can see everything here in Resident Evil 3 on the OLED Steam Deck. Now, if we push up the brightness on the LCD panel, it's actually still pretty good when you're looking at it like this, but the darker parts definitely get washed out because we're pushing everything up so high. And so that is one of the big benefits of having this OLED panel, is that that high contrast ratio will allow you to still see dark parts and bright parts no matter what conditions you're in. Another thing I wanted to show off here are the viewing angles between the LCD and OLED panels. And for reference here, the OLED panel has the kill switch case around it, so that way you can tell the difference between the two. Either way, no matter what angle I put it in, either further away or closer to me, you can see that at an angle, it's still a lot clearer on the OLED panel versus the LCD one. And that has to do with the viewing angles. Not only does it look really good straight on, but if you are holding it at an angle, it looks equally good as well. Now, in my impressions video, I tested a bunch of things, including adding a tempered glass screen protector to my OLED panel. And what I was trying to do here was to add a glossy finish to the OLED display, because for the most part, OLED panels are sold with a glossy texture to them. However, the review unit that I have has the etched glass, which diffuses the light. And so by adding a screen protector, I was trying to restore that glossy texture. And in some ways, it does improve the display. I think it makes the blacks a little bit darker, and I also found the colors to be a little bit more intense as well. However, the display itself still has a haze to it from that etched glass, and putting another glass screen on top of it does not remove it. And as a big downside, it also increases the reflectiveness of the display exponentially. And so while there are some positives to it, I found that there are more negatives than not. In the end, you're left with a hazy screen that's also reflective. And the footage that you're seeing right now is early morning here at the studio, and so we're getting direct sunlight in as the sun is rising. And as you can see in direct sunlight, the tempered screen glass protector does make it a lot more reflective. And so in the end, after a few days of testing, I did decide to remove that screen protector, because in the end, it wasn't really taking away from the haziness of the display, but then it was also making it too reflective. And so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to order the 512GB OLED model, and then later on I'll do a test between these two to see whether or not the etched glass or the shiny one is going to be better. Either way, another key takeaway here between the LCD and OLED panel is just how bright that OLED one is versus the LCD one. It really is a night and day difference even with the etched glass screen. Okay, next I want to do some audio testing, so I'm going to put my microphone right next to the Steam Deck, and to start we're going to test the LCD model versus the OLED one. And as a note, all of these volumes are going to be at 75%. Okay, before I make any judgments, I'm going to do another test here, and we're going to keep it at 75% volume, but I'm also going to throw the ROG Ally into the mix. Okay, so my impressions here are kind of surprising. First, the LCD model seemed to be the loudest among the three, and I also found that model to have the most brightness. It's one of my favorite features of the older Steam Deck. Now, according to Valve, they've balanced out the sound on the new one, and to me that makes sense. It does sound like it has a flatter profile. In fact, it is pretty similar to the ROG Ally now, and I know a lot of people actually prefer the ROG Ally audio over the Steam Deck. But I think for me, I still prefer that brighter texture of the LCD model. Long story short, the audio on all three of these devices is absolutely incredible, and a lot of it will come down to personal preference. Either way, I've got no complaints about the audio for this new OLED model. Okay, next we're going to test the fan noise. Now, instead of pushing everything to the max fan speeds, instead I'm going to play a game under a heavy load. So here I'm playing Resident Evil 3, but at max settings, something that the Steam Deck cannot keep up with. And we'll start with the LCD model running at a total package power of about 26 watts. And then after that we'll play the exact same game with the same settings on the OLED panel. Now, first takeaway here is that it is much quieter, but you also have to bear in mind that the fan is running at a lower RPM. And the difference here isn't huge, it's 5700 versus about 5200. So there's a bunch of takeaways from this experience. Number one is that the OLED panel is a lot more efficient than the LCD one. The exact same game in settings running at about 26 watt total package power on the LCD panel runs at about 21 watts on the OLED. So this means the machine doesn't have to work as hard in order to get the exact same results. And combined with the fact that the fan is quieter, there's a big difference between the two. So really when it comes down to it, if your favorite game runs really fast and loud on the old Steam Deck, chances are on the OLED panel, it's going to be a night and day difference between the two in terms of fan noise. And because the device isn't going to have to work as hard, you're also going to save on battery life. Speaking of which, let's move on to the next topic, which happens to be battery. So first I want to talk about these settings that I used in most of these games for my testing, and I actually went to this website right here, SteamDeckHQ.com. Here they've got an entire repository of a bunch of games that work on the Steam Deck, and they have individual pages that'll give you recommended settings and tweaks for each game. So for example, with Resident Evil 3 right here, these are the settings that I used in order to get the best performance that I could. And I'll leave a link to this website down below, it's a very handy resource. Now right off the bat, let's use Resident Evil 3 as our example. And the Steam Deck up front is going to be the OLED panel, the one behind it is the LCD. And I'll switch focus between the two as I'm talking, so you'll be able to see the numbers as they go along. Either way, what I did is I started up this game with the recommended settings at 100% battery life, and then I let it run for about 15 minutes. And after 15 minutes, you can see there's a big difference already. On the OLED panel, we still have 89% battery remaining, whereas on the LCD model, it's down to 83. And additionally, the LCD panel is running at a total package power of about 27 watts, and at this point, it says it has about an hour and 10 minutes remaining. Meanwhile, the OLED panel only requires about 22 watts to get the exact same results, and if you combine that with the 25% larger battery, we're getting a lot longer battery life. At this point, it says there's 2 hours and 15 minutes remaining on the battery. So right off the bat, in a very rudimentary test, as you can see here, there is a 1 hour difference in battery life between these two. And I'm really pushing the Steam Deck to its max. We're at max brightness for both panels, and I'm also using the recommended quality settings, so I'm pushing everything up to like medium-high settings in this game. And it's pretty impressive that we're already seeing a huge disparity between battery life on these two. Now, in addition, I did a bunch of other battery testing, so let's go through these results. Before we start, I do want to talk a little bit about my methodology. Number one, I've been on a bit of a time crunch. I think I've only had this device for about 4 days at this point, and I wanted to make sure that I got the video out before the pre-orders went live. And so as a result, I didn't have time to actually run the battery down for each one of these games. And so instead I took a close approximation. So what I did here is I charged the device up to 100%, and then I booted up each of these games with the settings that you can see here. And then I let each game run for 30 minutes. And I think by that time, the Steam Deck kind of settles into what kind of performance it's going to require to continue to play that game. And then I can also monitor the battery life as we go forward. And so at the end of those 30 minutes, I take a look at the total package power as an average, and then I calculate what the battery life is going to be, including with those 30 minutes that we've already used. And so these are the results that we're seeing here down below. They're not 100% perfect, but I think they're going to be pretty close. And so we'll start with Baldur's Gate 3 on the far left side. This game I played with the Steam Deck HQ settings, but with HDR turned on and locking it at 30 frames per second. And here I got 2 hours and 38 minutes of battery life. Now for God of War, I did something very similar, but I turned FSR off, and I kept it at low settings with HDR turned on. Here I got an average frame rate of about 40 frames per second, and I got better battery life, 2 hours and 50 minutes. Now for the next game, Cult of the Lamb, this one runs pretty well at medium settings at 800p resolution, and because I could, I also ran it at 90 frames per second. And this was a really wonderful experience, and we still got some pretty great battery life, 3 hours and 54 minutes altogether. Next up was Sea of Stars, a pretty lightweight game. This one I played it at 720p resolution because it's a 16:9 game, and then I just used the default settings but with 90 frames per second. And here it calculated over 6 hours of gameplay. And then finally, I wanted to try Celeste because this one will not go over 60 frames per second. So again here, 720p resolution because it's 16:9 and default settings. And I was surprised to find that we got over 10 hours of battery life, 10 hours and 48 minutes altogether. So yeah, as you can see, as a whole, battery life is greatly improved on the OLED Steam Deck. In fact, the battery life here is so good that it removes a lot of the battery anxiety that I get with most of these x86 handhelds. The fact that I got over 10 hours of battery life on Celeste is really kind of amazing to me. And the greatest thing about the Steam Deck and SteamOS is that I didn't have to configure any sort of power profile settings at all. The wonderful thing about this is all you have to do is just kind of figure out your target frame rate and the graphics that you want, and then the Steam Deck is going to take care of the rest, so no fiddling around with TDP or any of that other stuff. And for me, this is the perfect way to enjoy a handheld console like this. Now, in addition, I went back and I did the same thing with the LCD version of the Steam Deck just to make sure that we had a comparison between the two. So here's an apples and apples comparison between the OLED Steam Deck in orange and the LCD Steam Deck in blue. And there's a couple things worth noting. We'll start with Hades. Number one, you can see the battery life difference is not a bunch, it's less than a half hour. But the thing you have to bear in mind is I played Hades at 90 frames per second instead of 60. So not only did I increase the frame rate by 50%, but I had better battery life at the same time. Meanwhile, with Celeste, because it caps out at 60 frames per second, I just played it as is. And here you can see there's about a 3.5 hour difference between the two. To be fair, I always thought the battery life when playing Celeste on the Steam Deck was pretty amazing, but now we're at a point where it's even better, and that's pretty awesome. Now, in addition to playing a bunch of PC games, I also tested this out with emulation, and so let's go through those results here really quickly. Now for each of these, I did put down the total package power just so you could see how much power is being demanded by the emulator in game. So let's go through these one at a time, starting with Tears of the Kingdom. For this one, I played it in docked settings, but then also capped it at 720p, and I got an average frame rate of 28 frames per second, a little bit under 30. However, bear in mind that the entire time I was playing, it was also compiling shaders in the background. And Tears of the Kingdom is one of those games where you do have to play it for quite a while before it starts getting smooth. Regardless, I still had a great time in the 30 minutes I tested it, and I got about 3 hours and 5 minutes altogether of battery life. Further down the line, we have Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD. This one I was surprised to find that it did require a bit higher of a total package power, but also bear in mind that I was running it at the native 1080p resolution. And really the battery life here was still pretty darn good with 3 hours and 45 minutes. Now for the majority of Switch games I found they required a lot less power than Tears of the Kingdom. In fact, Super Mario Odyssey, one of the games that is more demanding, only required an average of about 11 watts altogether. And that is running it at 1080p and in docked mode. Here I got an average of 55 frames per second, but same thing here where it was compiling a bunch of shaders at the same time. And regardless, I got a ton of battery life, 4.5 hours altogether. Now for more lightweight games, I was even more impressed, starting with PlayStation 2. Here I played God of War, which is really kind of a demanding game. And even then, it only required a 7-watt total package power, even with a 3x upscale. And the gameplay was buttery smooth the entire time. And in this example, I got a little bit under 8 hours of battery life. And then finally, when it comes to retro systems, I did play Sonic 2 on the Sega Genesis, and this one required only 4 watts of total package power on average. And the battery life here was pretty incredible. We got over 12 hours altogether. This is pretty amazing. Anyway, to wrap up this section, yes, battery life is greatly improved on the OLED Steam Deck. In fact, I think it's probably the biggest improvement overall with this new model. Now, another question I got from a lot of people are those who were considering making a Switch, and a lot of people have upgraded the SSD, or maybe they've done a bunch of mods on it, or maybe they've just tweaked everything to perfection. And so the most prevalent question I got in my comments was whether or not you could swap out the SSD one for one. Now, according to Valve, they've already confirmed that you can do it, but all the same, I wanted to test it myself just to make sure I could. And so I did tear down both of my Steam Decks, and here's a look at them side by side. You can see that the heatsink has a totally different design, and the fan looks very different as well. In addition, it does look like they've made quite a few improvements to the overall integrity and structure, but I'm not going to go into detail here. If you want to see further analysis, I would recommend checking out the Gamer's Nexus breakdown. Regardless, to change out the SSD, I recommend unplugging the battery, and then you want to take off this heat shield up top. And it's only secured by 2 screws now, and so it's actually pretty easy to access. That being said, it is taped down in the bottom, and so I didn't want to take off this tape, and so instead I just kind of worked my way around it and then removed the SSD from there. After that, I took the original drive from my old Steam Deck and then put it inside, and then of course I put everything back together. Once everything's back into place, all you have to do is plug in your Steam Deck and then press on the power button. From there, all you have to do is unplug it and it should boot right up. And it took a couple minutes to boot that first time, but after that, yeah, I was right into my old Steam Deck hard drive on the new Steam Deck. However, bear in mind that on the old Steam Deck, I was on 3.5 beta, so you may have to upgrade your firmware. Either way, it's pretty exciting that this was a one-to-one swap altogether. Okay, so that's really all the testing and demonstration that I want to do for this video. Next, I want to talk about whether or not it's going to be worth upgrading if you already own a Steam Deck. So to help with this example, we're going to use 2 characters. These are going to be our test subjects. And their names are Freya and Cloud, and they're actually brother and sister. It just so happens that their parents were big fans of Final Fantasy. Now on the left, we have Freya, and she is super busy all the time. She's actually a stage manager at the local theater, and so she's running around all the time. Not only does she have to deal with things like open curtain calls and dress rehearsals, but she also has to manage all of the personal drama between all of the different actors. Now her brother's name is Cloud, and they're actually estranged. They haven't talked in like 5 years at this point. And Cloud's kind of the opposite of his sister Freya. His main job is stocking shelves at a grocery store. However, he doesn't work at a good grocery store like Wegmans. Instead, he just kind of works at a hole in the wall, and so no one ever really comes in and buys anything, and so as a result, he doesn't really have to stock the shelves very often. Instead, he's usually hanging out at the back of the store and scrolling through Reddit. Anyway, that's a quick background of each of our characters, so we'll talk about each of their different use cases, starting with Freya. Now, as you can imagine, because she has a very busy work schedule, when she gets home, she's completely exhausted. But one of her favorite ways to relax and unwind is to play her old LCD Steam Deck. And there are a couple factors to consider when it comes to whether or not she should upgrade to the OLED model. Number one, the type of games that she likes to play are like indie games and a lot of emulation as well. And in addition to some of the more modern indie games, she likes to go back and play older games too. So if you think about like Xbox 360 era. So she likes to play Fallout New Vegas and Skyrim and stuff like that. Now the thing she really likes about the Steam Deck is the entire console experience. She loves the fact that she can browse the Steam store directly on her Steam Deck and see all the sales and then purchase and download it right then. And then from there, she has a very console-like navigation menu, and even when she starts up a game, she doesn't have to mess with configuration changes either. So she does like the plug-and-play aspect of the Steam Deck once she had it all set up. Now, one of the things she doesn't like about the older Steam Deck is that it does give her battery anxiety. Because she's running around all the time, she can never remember whether or not she charged up her Steam Deck before she left the house. And so as a result, she loves to have as much battery as possible because she likes to sit down and play for many hours at once. And I think that for Freya's use case, an OLED Steam Deck is actually a really good fit. Number one, the Steam Deck is excellent when it comes to emulation. We have tools like EmuDeck that'll make things even better, and these games look gorgeous on an OLED panel as well. In addition, because we have these battery upgrades and efficiency improvements in the OLED Steam Deck, she's going to get a lot better battery life. And so she is definitely excited about the prospect of getting 4 hours plus in certain games. Not only that, the lightweight games that she enjoys playing, like the Xbox 360 era games like BioShock Infinite or Halo 4, these will all now play at 90 frames per second while still getting over 3 hours of battery life. And so for her, it's kind of the best of both worlds. Not only will her favorite games play better than before, but they'll also look better on the OLED panel, and many of them will play at a higher refresh rate, and she'll still get better battery life across the board by a bunch. So for Freya, I would recommend that yes, upgrading to the OLED Steam Deck makes a lot of sense. Not only that, the old Steam Deck is still going for a pretty good price on eBay right now. As of checking today, the 512GB LCD model is still selling for about $300 to $400. So considering that maybe she's going to pick up the $550 or $650 OLED Steam Deck, that means the upgrade cost is only going to be about $250 or $350 between the two. Now, whether or not all of those quality of life improvements are going to be worth that upgrade cost is really going to be up to Freya and her budget. But all the same, I think that if she does make that upgrade, she's going to be pretty happy with her improved experience. Okay, next let's talk about Cloud. And like I mentioned before, Cloud has a lot of time on his hands. And because he spends a lot of his time scrolling around on various subreddits, he's become kind of a connoisseur when it comes to PC gaming. For example, now his preferred way of playing are AAA games. He likes to play the latest and greatest. So he's the kind of guy who pre-orders a game and never really even checks out Steam sales. He just wants the best right now. And in addition, he wants to get the best performance possible, so he does not mind tweaking all those settings and everything else. Now, he also owns a Steam Deck, but he's found it kind of limiting. For example, he doesn't like the fact that he can't play Call of Duty or Destiny on his device. In fact, he even tried installing Windows on it because he didn't really like the whole Linux experience. He found it too limiting. And he's pretty well versed in Windows PC gaming, but he didn't really like using the whole Windex setup either. And so yes, Cloud is definitely looking forward to improving his gaming experience, but I don't think that the OLED Steam Deck is the answer here. After all, he may see some marginal improvements in performance with certain AAA games, but the difference here is not going to be a generational leap. After all, we're using the exact same APU, it's just a little bit more efficient. So given the fact that he was already feeling constrained by the fact that he couldn't play all of these games at 60 frames per second, I would wager he's not going to be impressed by converting over to an OLED Steam Deck. He's still going to have to deal with the limitations of playing these games at an 800p resolution and still only getting maybe 40 frames per second. And so because he doesn't want to deal with those limitations, I don't think that the OLED Steam Deck is going to be a good fit for him. The console is definitely a huge improvement over the LCD panel, but not really when it comes to performance. It's basically everything else that's better. So for Cloud, I would wager that something like the ROG Ally or the new Lenovo Legion Go might be a better fit. And chances are he's probably already purchased and tested these devices and took them back to Best Buy and decided that maybe he just needs to wait for the next generation. So for Cloud, I would say maybe enjoy the device that you have right now and then save up your money for the next generational leap, which is probably going to be a year or two from now. And so there you have it in a nutshell. We have Freya and Cloud, and both of these are Steam Deck owners who are looking to upgrade. And I would say that after going through this scenario, you can probably identify with one more than the other. And depending on who you identify with, will probably let you know whether or not it's worth upgrading for you with the Steam Deck OLED. For me personally, I am super happy with this new upgrade, and even though I did get this review unit in from Valve, I'm planning on buying my own. And like I mentioned, I'm going to try out the 512GB model because I want to see what it's going to be like with that glossy panel. So definitely expect more content from me with the OLED Steam Deck here coming in the next few weeks. For example, I want to do a big emulation showcase to show exactly what kind of performance you can expect. In particular, I'm excited to see what PlayStation 3 emulation is going to be like now that we have that bigger bandwidth RAM. Regardless, when it comes down to it, I think the fact that I am going to be buying an additional OLED Steam Deck says a lot about how much I think this is greatly improved. When I first heard that there was going to be an OLED upgrade, I thought it was going to be a lot like the Switch OLED upgrade. By that I mean that there were a couple cosmetic changes and then a new screen. And Valve could have totally gotten away with that, and I think a lot of people would have been happy. But instead, they went above and beyond in basically every single category that you can think of. Not only did they improve the panel way beyond what I was expecting, but they also improved the battery life by a ton, and that's easily the best feature that I found with this device. So at the end of the day, if you don't own a handheld PC at all, I still think that the Steam Deck is my #1 recommendation, and if you're willing to go up to the $550 to $650 mark to get the OLED model, I think it's going to be totally worth it, because the upgrades that you get between the $400 model and the OLED models is a night and day difference. And then of course, if you already have a Steam Deck, I do think it's worth the upgrade if it fits your use case. In particular, if battery life is your #1 concern, then yeah, I think it might be worth that investment. Anyway, let me know what you think down in the comments below. Are you picking up an OLED Steam Deck, and why or why not? And also let me know what other videos you'd like to see from me about the OLED Steam Deck or just the Steam Deck in general. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.